is our second installment of Tarragon Talks. Today I am welcoming my guests from My Sister's Rage with me today. We're going to have a little bit of a chat around land-based dramaturgy as well as humor and grief. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Ani, Yolanda Indishnakas, Gijibamanga Nindigo Makwa Mikizini Dodam, Fort William First Nation in Donjaba, Dagarando Ninda. My name is Yolanda Benell. My spirit name is Circling Wolf. I am Bear Clan on my great-grandfather's side and Eagle Clan on my great-grandmother's side. I'm a citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation. I come from Fort William First Nation near Thunder Bay, Ontario, otherwise known as Superior Robinson Treaty Territory. But my practice and I are now based here in Dagarando, and I'm the playwright and director.
Noedi, Noigambi, Anuga Olo Nadili, Olo Edidili, Nganosok. I'm Monique Mojica. I am an actor, playwright, dramaturg based in Toronto. I am Kuna and Rappahannock by birth and adopted into the Cayuga Bear Clan of the Haudenosaunee at Six Nations. And I play Wanda in My Sister's Rage.
All right,
So I thought I would start our conversation today just a little bit, I think, if you wanted to talk a little bit about your relationship with one another in terms of around this piece, if you would if you're comfortable with that, how you met, how land-based dramaturgy kind of came into your practice with one another, and we'll maybe go from there.
Yeah. I've heard of Monique Mojica. and when I was working on my play, White Girls with Moccasins, I was in Banff, and Monique was there at the same time. And so I think that was the first time we met in person. And I was working with Lindsay Lachance, who is a close, dear friend of mine now. And she was presencing a lot of Monique's work and had started talking about the work that she was doing on Kim's play Kamloopa. And the teachings and things that she was bringing into that process. And so there was that's sort of how I learned about Monique's work. And that was the first time we actually we met, and then I think it was just because you also know Natasha and Natasha's friend Natasha Greenblatt, who's also a friend of mine. There were just all these different connections that we had. And Lindsay as well. Yeah. So and then I think we just I just knew you from then.
We spoke the same language.
Yes, we're both Aquarius.
You have your own secret language.
Exactly. I've been working on land-based embodied Indigenous dramaturgies for quite a few decades now. Yeah. I didn't start using that language right away. But one of the things very early on that this probably segues into grief and humor a little bit, that I found that I had become so good at exploiting my own trauma that I was getting bored.
Yeah.
I had so many really sad, tragic stories. I was like, oh my goodness, I'm getting tired of this now, and wondering what I had that was intact. If I started in a different place, what would I get? If I started with something that I know was solid and was not ravaged or where there wasn't a rupture from colonialism, what would that do? And out of that came the idea that I would base a dramaturgical structure on the textiles, women's art, Kuno women's art from one of my nations, which are called Mola. So I started investigating in the studio, going to my grandfather's birthplace where I had never been, in Cunayala, which is autonomous territory in Panama and Colombia, and looking at how story narrative and literary structure is told in our cultures. And so Kuna women are called, they're referred to as walking books because the panels of the mola textile, which are many layers, which reflect the different layers of existence, of reality in Kuna culture, it can be read. But what happened is that I had to become literate in looking at molas. Even though I'd grown up with them, I've worn them all my life, to be able to, I'm not an expert,
Right.
but I can look at certain ones and I can name them. I know which one is the Sue mola, I know which one is the Kanso mola, I know which one is the Yarburba mola, I know which one is Tiba mola. Those are the oldest ones. And then there are ways that women are doing much more modern and contemporary. They do molas that are political posters or cereal boxes or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but they are legible stories. And I also use the pictographic writing that were notations for healing chants, and I made my own pictographic score. I wrote the show Chocolate Woman Dreams the Milky Way in pictographs. It's on 23 banner papers of pictographs, and then that was, yeah.
Whoa. So just like long streams of pictures that you're following.
Yes, and then that was transcribed into a script form. And then I did another show where we looked at the principles and story narrative in effigy mounds and earthworks, which are assembled in different places across the entire continent. We looked at, they're aligned, ones here line up with the ones in the Ohio River Valley.
Yeah.
We looked at their purposes and using those kinds of ways of telling story. And as my friend Chadwick Allen says, he's Chickasaw descent, he says that those effigy mounds and earthworks are the first literature of this land, and that they are not only on the land, but they're constructed out of earth itself.
Yeah.
So I started looking at what we had that tells story, instead of trying to take a Eurocentric structure and drop indigenous content in it, which is mostly what we have and mostly what we see, and mostly what gets produced because it's what institutions understand, right?
That's the storytelling that they're most used to seeing and considering that as the story. And so just to kind of reiterate what you were saying to me, Monique, back at you. I guess it's kind of the idea of, instead of pulling the story out of your own pain or your own trauma or any of those kind of pit feelings, the darker pit feelings, I guess I would put, it's taking story out of the land itself as we know it or as we have learned it from ourselves or from those who have come before us, so that the stories we're telling are coming from those landmarkers.
And being a conduit for the stories that are in land, place. And I couldn't have started to work this way unless I had gone to Cunayala and reconnected with family, land, and place.
Yeah.
And each time I start a new story, it has that same trajectory. What is my kinship to the people there? What is my kinship to the land? What is the kinship to the place? And what are the natural patterns of that land that create those shapes that are also can be adapted towards dramatic structures? And that's what I'm most interested now.
Yes.
You have to go and investigate and find out, and you have to put that language in your mouth.
You have to live it and have it, learn how to speak it with others, have it with you, so that when you actually get to that point of telling it within the story, you understand the wholeness of it all. I think it's a holistic way of approaching story, right? As opposed to just one side or the other. And I think my next question to stem off of that is how does this land-based dramaturgy work itself into My Sister's Rage?
Yeah, I mean, all of the things that I learned from working with Lindsay, and I took a workshop with Monique, which was really beautiful, embodying the land, and I remember at one point we were down listening to the earth and then had to find the rhythm of the earth in our bodies, and a lot of that just stuck, like it just stuck with me, and it felt like so right in a way. It's almost as if I uncovered something. It wasn't that something was dropped in and it was a new thing. It was like a blowing dust off of something, or something that had already existed inside of my body, that I was like, oh, of course, right? Of course. And so when I went away to write this story, I actually was, I applied for a residency and ended up in Newfoundland for 2 weeks in Newfoundland. And we stayed on the St. Lawrence and Gross Morin. And I don't know how to describe that whole time, because it was so energetic and powerful in ways that I don't think I quite grasp and still yet understand. But my grandfather was from Newfoundland, and so I had ancestors on that land, and I could really feel their presence. And because I was presencing a lot of the women in my family, I think that was a part of it. And I think that for me, ancestors and land are so connected. And I just every day would wake up to the water, and every day I would wake up to these rocks and these mountains, and I would wake up to these ice sheets and the way, and watching the way that the ice would come in the morning, and then or at night or something, and then in the morning it would all be water again. And then the next day it would be locked in by ice, and the next day it was like, no, it was never there. Yeah. Like I watched the land and I listened to it. And the first thing I said to everybody when we were introducing ourselves, I was like, this is what I'm going to be doing. Like, I am going to be listening to the land. And I'm like, you do you.
I'll be over here.
But they all were like, oh yeah, and so I think what was so informative for me was figuring out how to translate what the land was saying to me, because I feel like I lost that ability that I may have once had, and so it was taking in the shifts and the changes a lot, and putting those characteristics into the characters, or into the place of it. The story itself, it's placed where I'm from, which is Northwestern Ontario, which is very different from the East Coast.
Yeah. It has its other feel.
Yeah. But one thing is, the Anishinaabe actually originated in the East Coast. And there was a migration that happened because of a prophecy that told us all to move, to find Lake Superior. Really, it was to find the lake where food grows on water, and so that's why we're all everywhere, because we spread out. Yeah. And so this draw, I think, that I had, and the feeling I had, and even I went there last year, and I just was like, oh, there's something here, And even when I don't understand it, my body understands it before my brain does a lot of the time. And so I watched the way the land changed and shifted, and I would write, and I would watch, and I would write, and I'd watch, and And there was this one time, and I was sitting and drumming by this like ice floe, and I just wrote a song which didn't make it into the play because it didn't feel like it belonged there, but it was about listening to the land, and this ice floe was sitting there, and there was a crow and a seagull, like just like 2 crows or a seagull. There was only like 3 birds on this ice floe when I started, and I was recording myself, and over the time, more birds kept flying to this ice floe, more and more birds, and you can hear it on the recording, these squawks and squawks more as these birds kept coming while I was singing this song, and I and my face was like, ooh, it's happening, like, you know, I'm like these birds, and I was like, so I knew, like, when things like that happen, I know I'm on the right track, and yeah, and then there was just a point where I sat, and there's a library, and it overlooks the water, like it looks like you're on top of the water, and I sat in this library, and I just finished the play. And it was just like, I never in my life, like I think by that point I'd only written 2, 3 plays, and that never happened before where I just finished it.
Yeah,
like a draft.
That to me is also
unheard of.
I was gonna say, it's very cool to hear that, because there's a lot of playwrights I wouldn't hear that from.
I know.
I sat down and I just did it.
Yeah.
Like, that's not.
The other playwrights were not impressed, and because the first week I was just listening, right? I was like a little bit of writing and listening, and then I got a little stuck, and then by the second week I just like did it, and then I was like, okay, now we can go, you know. And they're like, what are you? And I was like, I just did the draft. I just did the draft.
I'm up and running. What are you guys doing?
What are you doing? Yeah, so that's kind of how, and then it just kept like, the more I like sat with it and like worked on it, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and growing and becoming more full. And then I started working with Lindsay on it too, which was really, really informative, because she really helped me land it in the land that it takes place on. And she really was like talking about the birch trees, talking about the cedar trees, bringing in the and so that really helped sort of define, really deepen the character's connection to the land, which was a huge aspect of it.
Which I am, like, because now I've read the play a couple of times, I'm noticing more and more how the characters are attached to the land within this piece.
Yeah.
And not only that, but there's an area within the writing that is always, there's a lot of breath in your writing. There's a lot of breathing, and I think that that also came from your time in nature, I would assume, because...
Yeah, because we don't have that here.
There's no breathing in Toronto.
You don't want to here.
There's odd smells.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that there's that feeling within this play is that there's breath.
Yeah.
Like you feel like the characters can breathe when they're allowed to, which...
Well, because the land breathes.
Yeah.
And I feel like so many of us have lost the synchronicity of breath with the land. And when you are out on it or in it, I mean, it's here too, but it's different. And when there's space and you're on areas that are less touched or less ravaged, or where there's more space, I think
lends itself well to land-based dramaturgy as well, because I think some of us do find ourselves on the land when we are grieving.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I just wondered if you had any thoughts or conversations around that.
Yeah, I feel like humanity is weird about grief, I think. Or at least I guess I should say more like Western civilization is I think a little straight. I feel like we live in this culture of like hiding your emotions, or you know, and like get over it, move on. Where there are cultures where it's different. And when I started writing this piece, my thing was, I grew up in a place where with women. Who laughed and laughed and laughed, and like I had a very, very, very tough childhood. I had a really, really rough go growing up, and so did the people in my family. and we were twisted and turned around in it all the time. And yes, there were lots of tears and there were lots of all kinds of things. But when I remember my aunties, like when I think about my aunties, mostly, I just hear them laughing. And for anyone who's been in like Native households, for the most part, it's laughter. It's laughter because you gotta laugh.
Yeah.
Because there's so much. What they're the only option. It can be the only option,
Yeah.
And I wanted to take and like what Monique is talking about earlier about like trauma porn and like and this idea of like I don't wanna sit in it, like I wanted to talk about how we find humor and how laughter is medicine in a lot of different ways, and so I thought about my when my grandmother passed away, and I had a really weird sort of understanding about death because I remember my great grandmother, like we had 5 generations of women alive at one time, and she's I think the oldest person who's lived in my family. I don't quite know how old she was, but I remember her, and I remember sitting on her lap when I was about 4 years old, and she would tell me stories. So I think I get my weaving from her. And I remember when she died. And I remember being at my mom snuck me into the hospital, and I remember seeing her at the hospital, and I remember being at her funeral, like just images, And that hit me in a way where I didn't quite understand. I knew at that age, I didn't understand something about it. I was like, the adults are acting weird, and something's going on, and I'm never going to see her again. And those were the only things I kind of got, And then a couple of years later, when my mom met my stepdad, and I grew up living with my grandparents, so we all lived in this house, right, this little shack. And when my stepdad was moving us away, I was so terrified that my grandparents were going to die. That was my first thought.
Yeah.
Was my grandparents are going to die and I'm not going to be here.
Yeah.
And I remember praying, please don't take my grandparents away until I understand about death. And I was like 5 years old at this time.
I totally understand what this is.
That's what whatever this is, I don't know, And so when my grandmother passed, it was this. I had this moment like right before where my best friend's grandmother passed away, and I remember having this feeling of, oh, I get it, because I watched her family come together, and I grew up with people dying all over the place. Like my family dropped like flies. And it just, it's not my it's real. I mean, it's just humor. It's true, yeah, exactly, right? Like, but that was the thing. I grew up around funerals all the time.
Yeah.
But I didn't even, I was sad and moved, and I was like, these are, But I watched people. Like, I watched people at luncheons cracking jokes, and like immediately,
Yeah.
The way that we come together and sort of, find the humor in it, and it was like laughing at them. It was laughing at their life. It was,
That's a big idea of the celebration of it.
Yeah.
And I think that, at least within my family, it's similar. A lot of the times we feel similar. We make a lot of jokes around death.
Yeah.
Make a lot of jokes around pain, and it's an easier way to deal with it than to shove it aside or to just go along to get along.
Yeah.
Just suck it up and keep going.
Yeah.
There's a funny thing in theater now that Native theater creators are encouraged to tell those really hard, traumatic stories. So we were having a conversation before, like how do we tell those really painful stories? They need out, they need telling, but how do you do that without re-traumatizing the actors and storytellers who are inhabiting that, without re-traumatizing your audience who have also lived that? And how do you do that without exploiting your own trauma? Without doing it for the titillation for the ones who are being voyeurs on this hard, traumatic way of life.
Yeah.
And I think that, for me, the answer to that in my work has always been transformation. And those transformative energies those other than human energies, those energies, whether it's spiritual or land or animal, or cultural heroes. You know, this is where characters like the ones who have the roles like the crow in this play, that Wanda is also the crow, right? And those kinds of figures and storytellers and energies, their job is to transform. They're the great transformers. And the responsibility on Indigenous theater makers, in my opinion, is you gotta reach for that transformation. If you aren't taking this morass and transforming it, then what's the point? Then you're just swimming around in the porn of all the trauma.
And all the pain, just swimming in the pain.
And staying there.
And staying there, yeah. Treading water in the pain, which is terrible. Actually, it's a terrible image as well. But it's this idea of having that transformative moment on stage and through these stories, I think helps grow the stories, right? It brings more of us in. It also allows us to release that without ever feeling like it will hold, back into the body. Because we're releasing it with a more holistic viewpoint. It's the pain sits in different places instead of just in one spot.
It is about the body. It is about the body. Whereas a lot of Western theater, what is upheld, what is elevated, is what happens just here.
Just in the front of the brain.
Just here. And our stories are all of those levels, from underworld, body, mind, spirit, heart, other than human world, other than human levels of reality, the unseen world. And that's what's in My Sister's Rage, as well as all of those levels of what do you see, what do you not see. And these are the questions that we just rolled in from rehearsal. We're like, this is not necessarily my street code, but that's a question that I asked Yolanda towards the end of the rehearsal. Okay, what am I seeing and what am I not seeing? As an actor playing someone who goes in between those levels of reality, making those kinds of decisions, because as humans in our life, as we kind of go, you see that? We often see, and it's part of our rehearsal day, the awareness of that unseen world, that world that you are aware of, that you see not through these eyes, but that you see.
Things like that.
Well, it's just this disregard of our lived experiences. Like it's this idea that, often it's like we'll give you a space, but we control it.
Smudge.
You can't smudge, or you can only smudge in certain spots.
Go outside.
Go to the room down the hall and around the corner, down the stairs, and or whatever it is, or that there's no space to hold the potential trauma of a day, of our lived experiences are very different, and so we have to hold space for that. We have to, especially in our storytelling. This is storytelling. It's ancient. It's ancient. I've been thinking about a lot about lately because I'm writing this thing, but there's this thinking a lot about ancient storytelling and how our ancestors have been doing this for thousands of years in different ways. This isn't new.
As much as you keep thinking it is.
It shouldn't be as revolutionary. It shouldn't be. It's and it takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of space, and we have to be okay with that. Because at the very core of this story and of storytelling in general, the storytellers are the ones that are holding it, that have to hold it in their bodies every day.
And we're not thinking about everything else you're already holding in your body.
Exactly.
You walk outside, and then you have to come into the room and somehow release that. And it's not always that easy. And so allowing to have that space to release, but also to hold, is a huge thing.
Yeah.
And some days you get all of the work done the way you think you're going to. And some days you have to care for an individual within the
that's
space
right.
because
Exactly.
something else has come out.
Yeah.
And that's just the way I think we have to look at storytelling in general
Yes.
and our storytellers. We have to hold that much care, right?
We have to remove the preciousness out of theater.
Yeah.
We cannot continue to be precious about money,
Many times.
about the institution. We can't.
Schedules.
Schedules.
The show must go on.
We can't, because that is where harm happens.
There's a lot of really unhealthy sayings we have in theater. It's
Oh,
the thing that I've been clocking
yes.
more as I'm around where I'm like,
Yes.
the show must go on. Like, all these things.
Downright violent.
It's a little intense. Like, the more I look at it and the more we look at the industry as we're moving forward, I'm always like, wow, we really were running ourselves ragged.
And people were just okay with it,
Yeah.
because it's the way it's always been done,
Yeah.
which is not true.
No, it's not.
It's the way it's been done since colonialism.
Yeah.
But, you know,
The colonialism is a fun thing. It's an adventure that we're all on, I would say, as we're all trying to release
yeah.
the past. Some of us are more affected than others, but we are all affected, is what I have
Yes,
been saying to a lot of people. Is that
absolutely, yeah.
as much as we, well, within BIPOC circles, we want to blame certain people. But what I would always like to reiterate is that we are all affected by colonialism within our modern times at this moment.
Swimming in it.
It's not good for anyone.
No, none of us are
It's
okay.
the same, in the same way that the patriarchy is not good for anyone, capitalism not good for anyone.
No.
None of these things are good for anybody. And like I think a lot about like the way that we're holding space right now. Like what would happen if everyone chose to hold space this way? This shouldn't just be reserved for us. Reserved. We're allowed to laugh at it. Yeah, I just think like, I just feel like people are just so like intent on holding on to the way it always was, because it serves some people.
Yeah, but it doesn't serve.
It doesn't serve everybody.
No, but I think it's around like land-based dramaturgy, as we were talking about. That's a very holistic way of approaching
Yes.
playmaking that we haven't necessarily been doing in a Eurocentric environment, if at all. Like usually we just sit around a table, read a script, and then we're like, got any questions? And then off we go.
Yeah.
You know?
I was very curious on whether the way that I've been approaching finding story and finding story from land and place would work with non-Indigenous actors. And I have taken it. I did land-based embodied, a little one workshop with actors in Poland.
Oh.
I had a class I was teaching at UVic, and I believe I'm going back there to do that again in person. But it's a different ball game.
Yeah.
But you're still talking about the human body on a piece of land, opening a conduit to use the body to tell story.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to me that it can be taught, because I'm very curious about, as much as we talk about climate crisis, all the things that we've done up till now have not been terribly effective. You know, the marching in the street, the petitions, the taking big, what do you call it, declarations to the big glass houses and all. And we're 2 minutes to midnight. So one of the questions that I had, and it came in a time of ceremony, is that what would happen if non-Indigenous folks, non-tribal peoples in the world could feel what we feel about the earth? What if they could feel that connection? What if they could re-knit that was cut off for them long before it was cut off for us? And that was a big question I had in the last few times I've gone to Europe and gone to pre-Christian sites. earth mounds
Mhm.
and hill cities and
Yeah.
burial grounds, and what would happen? I still have the question, and it's not my primary goal to do that.
Yeah.
But when you say it's not good for everybody, so
But I think it's
those folks that I come into contact with as a teacher here, what happens to them
Mhm.
if they can be made to feel earth? And some of the answers that the students that I was working with last year were really interesting. Like even one guy said, because I would have assignments for them every week, they had to do a land-based, just find a little piece of land somewhere, listen, tell the story. And this one guy said, well, I live 12 floors up, so the first thing for me is being able to get down to here,
Yeah.
So things like that, just finding a place where you can hear the wind, finding a place where you can hear the water. It was a big deal for these students.
I'm sure it was, because I feel like a lot of those students probably have never been asked to do exercises such as that, to be as aware of their environment as they might need to be to tell a story about it, I think that's a gift you probably gave them, Monique, if I'm being honest.
It was very interesting.
Yeah, it would be very interesting. And I hope that you do more also with different human beings across the spectrums, because I think that would help everybody's understanding of their placement on the land, really.
We also did it in Providence, Rhode Island, which was a very interesting thing because we went to the wharf.
Oh.
And we didn't know anything about, none of us, even the kids that were going to that school. And the stories that were coming out of there when we got back to the studio, because I also make them walk back to the studio without
As you should.
talking, without releasing it. And all these stories about auction block and slavery and whaling ships were because it came from the land there. And then they went and investigated in archives of what was at that park.
Yeah. What was
And
that?
it was a slave market.
And I think, that's a realization that colonialism too, It's all attached. I don't know, what time, where are we at?
Currently sitting at 5:45. It's got 15 minutes left.
15 minutes, okay, so this is the point where I'm like, does anybody have any questions in the room? But I can give my beautiful gift. my fancy hats. Does anybody have any questions?
We got introductions from these two, but not from you.
Oh, yeah, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I am just a stranger over here talking to these two. My name is Micah Payne. I'm the Associate Artistic Director here at Tarragon. I hang out here a lot. No, I'm not.
Just in this room.
Just in this room. I'm just here all of the time. Behind this curtain is which is odd because there is a bed and like a fridge and weird things behind the curtain.
There's a bed behind you?
I think it doesn't matter. There's a curtain.
Pay no attention.
Yeah.
Eating me up.
Tell me there's a bed back there.
But yeah, so that's me. I didn't remember to do a land acknowledgement either, but we are here in Toronto. I can read it just in case. We're here in Toronto, stewarded by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are bound by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Agreement. Basically, you should research this treaty. That's what I'm going to say. You should learn more about the Dish with One Spoon Agreement, understand your placement within that agreement, and your placement on the land here. I think it's really important because it's a treaty that really should have been honored. Like any law. It really, really should have been.
Yeah, look up the Toronto Purchase.
Yeah.
You'll learn a lot.
You will. Yeah. And
I always think of the most interesting bit of information that I learned about was that the islands are unceded.
Yeah.
The Toronto Islands were never part of the agreement, and then they just started. So when I think about Ward's Island and how all of that residential property is only inherited, you can't buy any of it; it gets inherited, which feels so gross. And the islands were ceremonial spaces.
lands.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they were ceremonial spaces.
Yeah.
And so when you go there, you can feel it, and it's again, like the rest of this area is just so ravaged. It's just, Hyde Park too. There's ceremonial spaces in Hyde Park that are now
56 mounds in Hyde
Yeah.
Park.
56.
that are all tourist attractions now.
Whoa.
And one in Magwood Park, the Thunderbird Band.
Mhm.
There's one out in Scarborough, Tabor Hill. You kind of have to know they're there before you recognize them, but once you know they're there, it's like, how could you not see
How could you
it?
not?
There's like this, there's 500 people in that mountain, Scarborough.
Wow.
you know, so-
And so the
And
things
little
that are-
residential areas, little ranch houses around it, so it's like, we're still here.
Did you say they were tourist attractions now? I didn't hear what you
Well,
said.
Hyde Park, right?
Yeah, okay.
People walk through Hyde Park, and there are areas that you're not meant to walk on, top of, over, beyond. And often I learned that there are areas when our people did ceremonies, they were at the bottom of it, not over. But people are like,
Just over it, around it.
I mean, well, look at Niagara Falls. Like Niagara Falls is the biggest tourist attraction. That was one of the stops on the Anishinaabe migration. It was a sacred space. But because they were sacred spaces, that's the first thing that gets turned into
Some sort
a
of-
tourist attraction is come look at this.
Come look at this thing.
Yeah. And I think about your show, I think about Izzy and the fetishization of Indigenous people and the fetishization of the land and land marks, like and these places that we're talking about, that they're very like, it's very locked in the same.
Their
Yeah.
intersections.
Yeah.
In the St. Louis World's Fair 1904, where a lot of this play, Izzy and the Alchemy of Enfreakment takes place, they destroyed 16 mounds in order to build that park where the World's Fair took place, which was one of, all of those World's Fair, 1898, Paris and Chicago, they were meant to exalt and show off progress versus savagery, civilization, how far civilization and civilized man, or white man, came. And we provided the savagery in the human zoos and congresses of curious peoples and all of that. But a lot of what we know as native performance grew out of that. Grew out of the human zoos, the freak shows, the Wild West shows, vaudeville, Hollywood.
This performance of stereotype is something that I talked about with people from Cockroach, but this idea that there's this stereotypical performance that we are then almost forced to do for outside audiences that we've just kind of been pushed into. That kind of now has weird lines in the storytellings
Yes,
that we have.
even our own.
Even our own.
Even our
That's
own.
the,
Those
that's the
tropes
thing.
are there.
Yeah.
The
tropes
minstrel
exist.
shows and the Wild West shows often traveled together. They had their own spot outside of the bigger shows, the
Yep.
circus, and they were.
Just off to the
There was
side.
the side
Yeah.
show, and then there was the side to the side. And that's where we were. you know.
Minstrelsies, cabo shows, all of those things, yeah. And then you end up, that's where a lot of the clown things come from. At least within my culture, where people are overly clown, the black shirts, I think is always the performance of the stereotype. It's a progression of the minstrelsy show, right?
Yeah.
So I definitely understand.
Which
that.
isn't the same thing as deconstructing it.
No,
Right?
it's not the same
It's
as
when you're
deconstructing.
recreating it that
Yeah.
it gets really dangerous, but that's what we're asked or required to do by the outside gaze.
Which has happened for a long time. I
A
think for
long time.
now, as we're moving forward, we're deconstructing a lot of those, and we're having a lot more conversations around the deconstruction of these tropes, of these stereotypes, and how can we enhance, really enhance our presence as people of color on stage in a way that doesn't fall into those stereotypes. Or if it does fall into those stereotypes, we're unpacking it and transforming it into something else.
And that's where I think we really have to look at trauma and humor, tragedy and humor in our own work.
Oh, definitely in our own work, I would.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to laugh more in the room than anywhere else when we're dealing with these plays that fall into trauma porn, or the idea of putting our trauma on stage for the display of others without actually dealing with any of the things. And I think unpacking that, moving away from just putting the trauma on stage and actually looking at how we heal through trauma and transform that trauma into something else is actually the more important form of storytelling that we're going on now, right? It's not just it's not just like let me rip my body open for you on stage and then leave you with that. I think
Sometimes it still is.
Sometimes it's still valid.
Sometimes it's still, I still see it, is what I'm saying. Like,
well,
sometimes it's still out there, like people are still doing it.
but I think the goal is that we move away from it.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Like,
That's
as much as
we're trying.
we're still doing it.
Yeah.
I think
I'm
it's also
still
moving away.
required to do that.
Yeah.
Unless I, as actor, say, no, wait a minute, I can't walk around like this.
I can't do this.
Now hold on a
You know,
second.
just take it, you know,
Wait.
let's put the organs
Yeah.
back.
Yeah. Wait just a second here.
Yeah, I'm not for all of this on stage. Yeah, and I think that's the task for us as storytellers within that community, to just keep pushing that and just kind of also advocating for those who are coming up behind us to know that they don't have to put that all on stage to,
Yeah,
you
there's
know,
other ways of doing, there's other ways of addressing
all of this.
these feelings
Yeah.
and these experiences that don't have to be so
Graphic.
graphic.
Yeah. And also understanding that you don't have to do that to get funding. Because I think a lot of people think that I have to put all of this on the page and put that forward to get funding for my show, because that's what people think they need.
Sometimes that's the problem though, like sometimes that is the problem. Like I think that sometimes I have talked to playwrights who try to focus on, I think the most underproduced Indigenous playwrights are the playwrights that are focusing on.
And how, I don't know if that's an answerable
No,
question.
yeah, I know, I hear what you're saying. I think the important thing to remember is that what you might see in the play or feel or experience in this piece is something that's very real. There's often this idea that when we talk about ancestors or spirit, or when we talk about dream world, or when we talk about a trickster, or when we talk about animal connections or land connections, that it's magic, or that it exists in this world that's like not real, and it is tangible, it is real, and I think that is the piece that often gets lost in there, is somewhere between that, like it turns into reverence, it turns into the noble savage, it turns into this idea that we're I don't know how to describe it. It's the noble savage trope is probably one of the biggest things, and what I'm seeing a lot now is the return to that. Is there's a return of this like ultimate reverence of Indigenous people, like and it's just like maybe
Going too far the other way.
It's going too far the other way.
Yeah.
And just leaving it as an understanding of like that is a real lived existence, as opposed to thinking like thinking about it. Am I making any kind of?
I think also, I mean, when we have these conversations ongoingly, although the things in the play and the story are real, we are also really, really careful not to use actual ceremonial objects or do an entire ceremony in the play. We have props.
Yeah.
You know, there's things that represent the real thing, because it's not appropriate to take something that is collectively held, collectively private, and expose it that way. So we had this conversation. At the moment, I'm using Yolanda's personal drum. That's not the drum that I'm going to use in the show. We'll have a prop drum, because something that has been activated for a specific ceremonial purpose
And personal purpose,
must not be exploited. I mean, it's the same, it's an old theater thing, like if you're gonna have a Bible on the stage, it's never a real Bible, right? It's not too far away from that.
Does that answer your question?
Were there any more questions, actually?
Just love the fact, hi, I just love the, like, it is when you were just saying that, Yolanda, it's moving away from the esoteric. It's not esoteric, right? In terms, or ethereal. Like, it's like the notion of it, of this notion of spirituality, ancestral presence. It's explicable but not explicable at the same time. Like, so I love the fact that you just said the fact that there's a tangibility to it, because it's about there's still a connection to the senses within that, as opposed to it being like a way.
Yeah. And
anyway, there was a couple of things that you just said that resonated in other ways, like the noble savage, and I was going into like the magical Negro place. Or like we've talked a little bit about this notion of like the exchange of ancestral plane by virtue of land or community that you're in, and it just resonates so vividly. Love it.
I guess just adding to that I was going to say this and I forgot, that this work has been put through an artistic process. So you're not going to take something that's ceremonial and drop it in there raw. It's not, it has no root, it has no business there. That this is work that, although those things are tangibly real and they're part of our experience, this has gone through an artistic process.
Christians should understand all of that, because we don't do any of that stuff outside of the church.
Right. Yeah.
It's very true.
Yeah.
Would one of you like to comment on the role of humor as being a way of connecting universally with your audiences, and that what sort of commonalities are there, what differences are there in humor, and how you think that might help an audience or assist an audience, in connecting with what's going on stage?
Yeah, it's funny because the last year, I think, I've been working, a year or two, I've been working with Studio 180, who's like one of the co-producers, and we did like a Zoom reading that was recorded, and then it's been disseminated through high school. So I've been working with a bunch of high school students who have seen, like who have heard the script and have engaged with it. And everybody relates to it. Like, everybody finds their way into the piece, I think, in some way or another. I think most people, have struggle with their family members in some way. They struggle with their have had these relationships with their cousins, or have had family member pass away. Like, and so within that, I think the humor is part of that draw in that. Some of the humor in the play is very specific to Indigenous people, and some of it's very specific to my own community and to my nation. And then other parts of it are universal, and I think that it's these little pops of like, some of it's like a wink and a nod to my community, and then there's other things that are just like, I'm hoping that everybody finds their way into some of those jokes, into some of those humors, because like I think as humans have to laugh at ourselves, as like, look at us, what are we doing? Like in these bodies, like, what is this? And so I think for me that's a big part of it, is like, Wanda comes through talking about how laughter is medicine. You gotta laugh at it. Because what else are you going to do? And I think especially now, where we're in a big time of collective trauma. We're in a big time of we're in a mass disabling event right now. We're collectively grieving as globally. I think that sort of message of, you have to laugh at the journey, you have to laugh at the grief, you have to laugh at the death, you have to laugh at because what else are we going to do? And finding healing through sharing a joke or finding healing through conversations or silly things, like finding healing in relations and then the land. Like I just think that there's different ways of people can move through the humor and find themselves in it.
Cultural, and they feel in their bones. I mean, one of the times that was really the most obvious to me was back in the 80s on tour with the first production of the Riz Sisters, and we had run in Toronto, we went to Ottawa. First night in Winnipeg, I came out, I had the first word in the show, my whole first speech is in Cree, and the audience went up laughing, and I almost lost it because no one had ever understood. As someone they understand what I'm saying, and it's okay with me if it's not universal. I happen to be, I'm one of those pain in the asses. I don't believe in universality. It's kind of another way of saying, well, if we were all just white, it'd be cool. So I think it's really okay if there are things that only an Indigenous audience gets.
I think that's like most of this play though. That's the thing. like when I was like, there's a little bit, I'm like, no, there's a lot of jokes in this play that I'm like, oh yeah. And I think about that a lot actually when I think about Native plays going up and that are playing often to predominantly white audiences, that how difficult it is because I've been that performer, really how difficult it is as a Native performer up there when nobody's laughing. Mm-hmm. It's hard. It's really, really hard because then you're like, I gotta hold this whole show up like this, and I'm not getting anything from the audience because they don't understand or they just don't think it's funny because it's not part of their experience. Sometimes they don't know if they can laugh. I think there's a gamut. It runs the gamut across the board.
Especially when things are irreverent.
Yes. Yeah.
But I remember, remember Benny Hill?
Yeah.
I remember watching that and I'm thinking, why are people laughing?
Yeah.
Why is this funny? Is this supposed to be funny?
Yeah.
But I'm not a Brit.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's a different culture's humor.
Yeah.
And that's all right.
Yeah.
I think that's always okay. As somebody who's witnessed, black plays where I go in and I'm like, oh, that's fun. Well, nobody else is laughing. It's just me, loud and proud.
But they'll take it.
Yeah.
But they'll take it. And they'll use it. But I also last thing to say about this is that I actually think this just means that institutions need to do more work in terms of community outreach.
Yeah.
Because then if you're bringing more community into the spaces, we're not left up there holding the bag,
Yeah. We want to open the doors to more people because then that way if you have a more well-rounded audience, let's say, those who understand the jokes can help those who do not understand, and therefore the laughter kind of fills it a little easier, which is nice.
Yeah.
One of my outside comments is on reading My Sister's Rage. I find that there's a lot of really wonderful, humorous bits in this play that I think are for a lot of people, as well as it being extremely specific at times. And I think that is a really beautiful balance that you play with. So I'd love to offer that.
The more specific, the more universal.
Sometimes.
That's what I'm finding out.
Sometimes, yes.
That's what I'm finding out.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
And the thing is, like, because you play with, okay, I'm going to go off on another tangent, but family dynamics are always funny.
Yes.
There's always something within family dynamics that's ridiculous that we can always laugh at.
Yeah.
We all got cousins, we all got aunts. Okay, well, I think, we're done. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming and chatting with us today. We're offline. Okay, well, there's